Billionaire mocks poor boy, then realizes he's the one who needs saving. The rain pounded against the windshield as Morgan Freeman sat in his Rolls-Royce stranded on an empty road. No signal, no help. Dozens of cars raced by, ignoring the billionaire in distress. Then a boy appeared, barefoot, drenched, yet determined. He had nothing, yet his actions would change everything. Is kindness true power? Comment 1. Or is success just luck? Comment 0. For a moment, Morgan Freeman simply stared at the boy standing outside his car. Rain poured mercilessly, soaking the boy's clothes, yet he stood there unshaken, his expression unreadable, his stance firm. There was no trace of hesitation, no expectation of reward, just the quiet resolve of someone who had already decided to help. Need some help, sir? Freeman hesitated. It had been a long time since someone had spoken to him so plainly. For decades, his presence commanded boardrooms, interviews, and stages. People spoke to him with reverence, with admiration, or at the very least, calculated politeness. But this boy? He was looking at Freeman as though he were just another stranded traveler. A sharp gust of wind rattled the car. Freeman exhaled. Yes, it seems I'm out of luck tonight. The boy nodded, glancing at the car's sleek exterior before stepping closer. Freeman noticed then his feet were bare. The pavement was slick with rain, yet the boy didn't flinch as water pooled around his ankles. What happened? The boy asked, crouching slightly to inspect the tires. Ran out of gas, Freeman admitted, shaking his head. Wasn't paying attention. The boy smirked, not mockingly but knowingly, like someone who had seen this happen before. There's a gas station a couple miles down, he said, standing up straight. You got a gas can in the trunk? Freeman's brow furrowed. I do. Great. The boy gestured toward the back of the car. I'll go fill it up for you. Freeman blinked, caught off guard. The boy had offered before he even asked for anything in return. Are you sure? It's pouring out here. The boy shrugged. Rain's just water. Without waiting for another word, he stepped toward the trunk, his soaked clothes clinging to him as he moved. Freeman hesitated, then pressed the button to pop the trunk open. Inside was a shiny, unused gas can, still wrapped in plastic. The boy ripped off the packaging effortlessly, handling the container like it was something he had done 100 times before. I'll be back soon, he said, gripping the handle. Freeman leaned forward, frowning slightly. How far is the station again? 2 miles, the boy replied, already stepping away. That's a long walk in this weather. Not the longest I've had, the boy said over his shoulder. Then, just like that, he disappeared into the night. Freeman watched through the windshield as the boy's figure faded into the darkness, swallowed by rain and distance. For the first time in a long time, he felt powerless. Not because he was stranded, not because of the rain, but because he wasn't the one in control. He was used to paying for convenience, for solutions. When problems arose, he wrote checks, made calls, delegated tasks. That was how the world worked for men like him. Yet tonight, his money meant nothing. He had offered cash, and the boy had turned it down without hesitation. Freeman leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples. Who just helps a stranger like that? The boy had been so certain, so steady, and he wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't doing this to impress anyone. He was simply helping because it was the right thing to do. Freeman glanced at the digital clock on his dashboard. 12 minutes had passed. Rain hammered against the car, the storm showing no signs of slowing. Freeman's thoughts drifted. Where was the boy headed after this? Where did he live? Who was waiting for him? Or worse, was anyone waiting for him at all? 37 minutes later, just as Freeman's mind began spinning worst-case scenarios, movement appeared in the distance, a shadow emerging through the rain. Freeman straightened in his seat, gripping the steering wheel as he squinted through the water-streaked windshield. It was him. The boy was soaked, shivering but still walking with purpose. In his hand, the gas can swung slightly with each step. Freeman barely processed his own actions. His hands moved on instinct, pushing the door open, stepping out into the rain. You're freezing, he said as the boy reached him. Yeah, the boy admitted, teeth chattering slightly. Rain's getting colder. Freeman reached for his coat, instinctively moving to wrap it around the boy's shoulders. But the boy stepped back. I'm okay, sir, just pop the gas tank open. Freeman hesitated, then nodded, quickly doing as he was told. The boy unscrewed the cap and began pouring the fuel in, his hands steady despite the cold. Freeman couldn't take his eyes off him. Most kids his age would have complained. Most grown men would have walked away, but not this boy. As the last drop of gas emptied into the tank, the boy capped the container and stepped back with a satisfied nod. That should get you to the station, he said, wiping his wet hands against his shirt. Freeman reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick wad of bills, far more than the gas cost, far more than necessary. Here, take this. The boy barely glanced at the money before shaking his head. No, sir. Freeman froze. What? I don't need it. The billionaire stood there, completely at a loss. You walked 2 miles in the rain to get me gas. You're soaked. Just take it. The boy smiled slightly, but the quiet conviction in his eyes remained. Helping someone isn't about getting paid, sir. He turned, walking away before Freeman could say another word. Freeman stood in the rain, watching as the boy disappeared into the storm just as suddenly as he had appeared. For the first time in his life, Morgan Freeman was left speechless, not by wealth, not by power, but by the quiet dignity of a boy who had nothing, yet gave everything. Morgan Freeman sat in his luxury Rolls-Royce, the engine now humming smoothly, but his mind was far from at ease. He gripped the steering wheel, staring through the rain-soaked windshield at the empty road ahead. The boy was gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving behind only the ghost of his selflessness. Freeman had met thousands of people in his lifetime, business moguls, world leaders, visionaries, yet few had left him as unsettled as the boy who had just walked away from him without asking for a single thing in return. Who was he? Where was he going? And more importantly, why had he turned down the money? He had met men worth billions, yet they would never refuse an extra dollar if offered. But this boy, barefoot, soaked, clearly living with little, had simply smiled and walked away. The billionaire felt something he hadn't in a long time. Humbled. Freeman shifted the car into gear and began driving, but his mind was no longer on the road. His whole life, money had been the answer to everything. A solution, a tool, a weapon. But tonight, it had meant nothing. The boy didn't ask for recognition, didn't expect repayment, didn't hesitate. That kind of person was rare, almost impossible to find in the world Freeman lived in. He passed neon-lit gas stations, darkened storefronts, and rows of abandoned buildings as he made his way back into the city. He found himself wondering, where was the boy now? Was he walking home in the freezing rain? Did he have a home to go to? For the first time in years, Freeman felt guilty about what he had. The wealth he had accumulated, the influence he wielded, none of it could compare to what that boy had just shown him. Kindness without condition. That night, Freeman sat in his penthouse suite, high above the city, but his thoughts remained in that darkened road. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy. He had built his fortune by reading people, understanding motives, predicting behavior. And yet, this child had done something no business partner, no investor, no rival had ever done, left him speechless. His glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table. The oversized clock on the wall ticked away, but he remained frozen in thought. Who was he? And why did Freeman feel like he owed him something? Something that money couldn't buy. His mind made itself up before he even realized it. He had to find him. The next morning, Freeman's Rolls-Royce pulled into the same gas station the boy had walked to the night before. He parked near the entrance and stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. The cashier, a man in his late 50s, looked up from the register, startled to see a billionaire standing in his rundown shop. "Morning," Freeman greeted. The man nodded, unsure how to react. "Morning. What can I do for you?" Freeman slid a crisp $100 bill onto the counter. "I'm looking for a boy, about 14. Walked in here last night in the storm, bought a gallon of gas. Barefoot." The cashier blinked, then scratched his beard. Yeah, I remember him. Kid came in soaking wet. Didn't say much, just paid and changed, took the gas and left. Freeman's stomach tightened. Do you know his name? The cashier hesitated. Nah, but I've seen him before. Think he lives over in the old neighborhood by the train tracks. That was all Freeman needed. He left another 100 on the counter and walked out. The train tracks led Freeman to an old part of the city, one he hadn't been to in decades. It was the kind of place where buildings sagged under their own weight, where children played soccer barefoot in the streets, and where hope seemed like a distant memory. He parked near a row of crumbling houses, stepping out onto the uneven pavement. This wasn't his world. He had spent years surrounded by luxury, by excess, by power, but this place reminded him of something he had buried deep, a past he had long forgotten, a time before wealth, before influence, when he too had once known what it was like to have nothing. He shook the thought away and approached a woman sitting on her porch. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely. "I'm looking for a boy, about 14, tall, skinny, barefoot. He helped me last night." The woman studied him carefully. Rich men didn't come to this part of town. "You talking about Caleb?" she finally said. Freeman nodded. "Where can I find him?" She pointed toward a small house at the end of the street. "That's his place. But good luck. Kid don't like handouts." Freeman nodded his thanks and walked toward the house, his heart beating faster than expected. He wasn't sure why he was here. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe guilt, or maybe, just maybe, he needed to understand what made this boy different. Freeman knocked, the sound echoing through the thin walls. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and there he was. Caleb, dressed the same as the night before, except now his face showed the same shock Freeman had felt on that dark road. "Mister," the boy asked, eyes wide. Freeman smiled. "I figured if you could walk 2 miles for me last night," he said. "The least I could do was drive a few for you." The boy hesitated, looking behind him, as if unsure whether to let Freeman see what lay beyond the door. "Why?" Caleb finally asked. Freeman thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "Because people like you are rare, Caleb, and I don't walk away from rare things." But what Freeman would find beyond that door would change him forever. Morgan Freeman sat in his warm, leather-clad interior, the engine of his Rolls-Royce now purring steadily. Yet, despite the comfort, he felt unsettled, as if something inside him had been shaken loose. His mind replayed the moment over and over, the boy standing in the rain soaked to the bone, yet turning down money as if it were worthless. How many people had Freeman met in his lifetime who would do such a thing? None. He had built an empire understanding people, predicting their motives, their desires, their greed. But this boy, he didn't fit the equation. Freeman glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to still see the boy walking away. But he was gone, vanished into the storm like a ghost. Something gnawed at him. He put the car in drive, but he didn't head home. Freeman didn't fully understand why he was driving back to the gas station. He told himself it was just curiosity. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The same cashier from last night stood behind the counter, reading a crumpled newspaper, barely looking up as Freeman entered. But when the billionaire placed a $100 bill on the counter, the man raised an eyebrow. "You lost something, sir?" "Not something," Freeman said, "and someone." The cashier frowned, setting the paper down. "A kid, about 14, walked in last night barefoot, bought a gallon of gas. Ring any bells?" The cashier's expression shifted, recognition flashing across his face. Yeah, I remember him," he muttered. "Came in soaking wet, paid in nickels and dimes. Didn't say much, just thanked me and left." Freeman's jaw tightened. "What's his name?" The cashier scratched his beard. "Don't know, but I see him around. Think he stays in the old neighborhood by the train tracks." Freeman threw another 100 on the counter. "Where exactly?" The man hesitated, but money spoke louder than doubt. With a sigh, he gave Freeman the directions. The drive to the boy's neighborhood was a stark contrast to the world Freeman was used to. The smooth pavement of the city gave way to cracked sidewalks, abandoned buildings, and rusted fences barely standing. Children played in the streets, kicking a dented soda can as if it were a soccer ball. Laundry hung from fire escapes, swaying in the wind. Freeman felt a deep, aching familiarity. He hadn't been to a place like this in decades, not since he was a boy himself, not since before money had changed everything. He pulled up near a weathered house at the end of the block, its porch sagging under years of neglect. A woman sat outside, rocking gently in an old chair, watching the world with tired but sharp eyes. Freeman stepped out of his car, his presence an immediate anomaly in this place. The woman raised an eyebrow as he approached. "You lost, sir?" "Not lost," Freeman said, offering a small nod. "I'm looking for a boy, about 14, tall, skinny. Helped me last night in the rain." Her expression softened. "That'd be Caleb," she said, "always helping folks." Freeman exhaled. Caleb. "Is he home?" The woman gestured toward the side of the house. "Out back. Fixing something, I'm sure." Freeman walked through the narrow pathway along the side of the house, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles. Then he saw him, Caleb, kneeling in the dirt, hammering a loose board back onto a fence. His hands were calloused, far rougher than they should have been for a child his age. Freeman stood there for a moment just watching. The way Caleb worked, focused, steady, unbothered by the world. Finally, the boy looked up. His expression flashed with surprise for just a second before settling into something calm, unreadable. "Mister?" he asked, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants. Freeman smiled slightly. "Figured if you could walk 2 miles for me last night, the least I could do was drive a few for you." Caleb squinted at him, then crossed his arms. "Why?" Freeman chuckled. "Because people like you are rare, Caleb." The boy studied him for a long moment. Then, instead of answering, he simply turned and walked toward the house. Freeman followed. The house was small but clean. The furniture was mismatched, the walls covered in hand-drawn pictures and fading family photos. A younger child peeked from behind a doorway, watching Freeman curiously. Caleb's mother moved toward the kitchen, putting on a pot of coffee without a word. An unspoken hospitality. Freeman took it all in. The cracked linoleum floors, the faint scent of something warm baking in the oven. It was a far cry from his penthouse with its marble floors and silent, sterile rooms. But somehow this place felt fuller. Caleb sat down across from him, waiting. Not intimidated, not eager, just waiting. "So," Freeman began, lacing his fingers together, "you walked 2 miles in a storm to help me, but won't take a dime for it. Why?" Caleb shrugged. "Because you needed help," he said simply. Freeman frowned. Most people would have kept walking or asked for something in return. Caleb smirked slightly. Maybe they ain't been raised right. Freeman leaned back in his chair, truly looking at the boy for the first time. There was no arrogance, no false humility, just an unwavering sense of who he was. And Freeman realized something then. It wasn't wealth that gave a man dignity. It was character. Freeman set his coffee down, his mind already racing. "Caleb," he said carefully, "what do you want to do with your life?" The boy raised an eyebrow, hesitating for just a moment before answering. "I don't know, sir." Freeman smiled. "Then let's find out. Because what came next would change Caleb's future forever." Morgan Freeman leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady, his voice softer than before. "What do you want to do with your life, Caleb?" The boy hesitated, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing a rough groove in the wooden table. For a moment, it seemed like he might not answer. Then finally, he exhaled and shrugged. "I don't know, sir, just trying to get by." Freeman nodded as if he expected that answer. He glanced around the small house, taking in the patched-up walls, the mismatched furniture, the way everything carried the weight of being well-loved but well-worn. This was a home built on survival, not luxury. It reminded him too much of where he had come from. and for the first time in years, he saw his younger self sitting across the table. "You ever thought about what you'd do if getting by wasn't the only option?" Freeman asked, his voice calm but pointed. Caleb frowned slightly. "I don't waste time thinking about things I can't have," he admitted. That answer hit Freeman harder than he expected. He had spent decades building wealth, ensuring security, creating opportunities. Yet here was a kid, bright, hardworking, full of potential, who had already convinced himself that dreaming was a waste of time. Freeman leaned back, nodding slowly. "What if I told you that was about to change?" Caleb blinked. "What do you mean?" Freeman set his coffee down. "I mean, I want to help you." Caleb's posture shifted slightly, not leaning in, not eager. If anything, he looked cautious. "Why?" he asked. Freeman smiled. "Because you remind me of someone I used to know." Caleb folded his arms, skepticism evident in his eyes. "I don't need charity, sir." Freeman chuckled. "Good, because I'm not offering charity." Caleb narrowed his gaze slightly. "Then what are you offering?" Freeman took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "An opportunity." The boy stayed silent, waiting. "You have something most people don't," Freeman continued. "Not just work ethic, not just kindness, but dignity. And that's worth more than money." Caleb shifted, unsure of where this was going. "I want to invest in you," Freeman said finally. That made Caleb pause completely. "Invest?" Freeman nodded. "I want to make sure you don't spend the rest of your life just getting by. I want you to have options, education, a real shot at something bigger." Caleb let out a slow breath. "And what do you get out of it?" Freeman smiled, leaning forward again. "I get to prove that the world still has people worth believing in." Caleb glanced at his mother, who had been silently listening from the doorway. Her eyes were cautious but hopeful. She had spent years scraping by, working late nights, doing everything in her power to provide for her son. Now a billionaire was sitting in their kitchen, offering to change his future. It almost felt too big to be real. Caleb turned back to Freeman. "If I say yes, what happens next?" Freeman smiled slightly, a knowing glint in his eyes. "We start small. We figure out what you love. We open doors that have been closed to you." Caleb inhaled deeply. "And if I fail?" Freeman shook his head. "Failure's just another way to learn, son." The boy considered the offer carefully. He had learned to mistrust easy solutions, to doubt promises from people who didn't know his struggle. But this didn't feel like a handout. This felt like someone finally seeing him for who he was and who he could be. Slowly, Caleb nodded. "All right, sir, I'll give it a shot." Freeman smiled, extending his hand across the table. "Then let's get to work." Caleb hesitated only a second before shaking it, but neither of them knew that this handshake would change both their lives forever. Years passed, but Morgan Freeman never forgot the night he met Caleb. What started as an encounter on a rainy road had turned into something far greater: a mentorship, a friendship, and ultimately, a transformation. Caleb, once a boy who only knew how to get by, had become a man with purpose, direction, and endless potential. With Freeman's guidance, he earned a scholarship, pursued engineering, and built a career he had once thought impossible. But the biggest change? Freeman himself. A man who had spent his life surrounded by wealth, power, and influence, had been taught a lesson not by another billionaire, but by a boy with nothing except dignity. One day, as they sat across from each other in Freeman's office, now colleagues rather than strangers, Caleb spoke. "Do you ever think about that night, sir?" Freeman chuckled, shaking his head. "I think about it every day." Caleb smiled. "I never thanked you properly." Freeman met his gaze. "Neither did I." They didn't need to, because in the end, respect isn't measured by wealth, but by how we treat the people who have none. And Morgan Freeman had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Because sometimes the richest man in the room isn't the one with the most money. It's the one who gives without expectation. Through this story, we realize that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in kindness, dignity, and respect. Caleb had nothing, yet gave everything. Freeman had everything, yet lacked the one thing money couldn't buy: humility. Power fades, money shifts, but how we treat people will always define us. In a world obsessed with wealth, this story reminds us that the richest hearts belong to those who give without expecting anything in return. Because at the end of our lives, it won't be what we owned that matters, but who we lifted along the way.